sustainable green energy matter? And is it realistic for Bitcoin mining at scale?
Yeah, my name is Yuri Bulovic. I'm VP of Strategy at Foundry. I'll be moderating this panel on green energy mining, ESG-friendly mining. Does it matter? Is it even realistic to expect Bitcoin to be 100% green energy, and other somewhat controversial topics? So hopefully we have a good discussion. I'll start with some intros on your company's background. So we'll go around, and if you could tell us about your mining operation, if you can specify also whether it's on-grid or off-grid, and which energy source you guys are using.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Devin Blitzer here. I am the CEO of Byo Energy. We're in the business of generating electricity for data centers. So if you have Bitcoin mine you want to bring, containers, building, we'll develop out the power plants and do all the transformation, provide land, and you just come and hook up your stuff. That's basically what we do. Very simple, and I'll pass it off.
Samuel Risberg with Soul Miner. We've done GPU-only mining since 2017. We started in Florida, and we're in Kentucky as well. We have solar, wind, a lot of hydro. We're mostly on-grid. We're trying to get a bunch of solar off-grid as well. Right now we have a 35 megawatt capacity, moving on to another 100 within the next 2 years, and a lot of that is going to be hydro and solar.
Russell Can with Core Scientific. We have, at the end of this year, 548 megawatts to be online with mining. Of that, 56% is carbon neutral. So that includes your renewables plus nuclear. We are 100% though carbon neutral as far as we use energy credits for the other piece. More importantly though, everything we're building going forward, we have a keen eye on the carbon neutral piece. So.
Aaron Tilton from SmartFi, and we're kind of a little different where we fund projects. So we've got projects all over the world and a variety of different energy sources. And so we don't mine directly, but we fund the projects. And they're, again, like I said, all over the world. And our background as a company actually is an energy developer. We used to own an oil and gas pipeline business and develop power plants in the western US.
Good afternoon, everybody. Dave Perrell, CEO and co-founder of Compute North. Background's 25 years in data centers. Compute North specializes in tier 0 computing, so large-scale infrastructure for miners. We have 3 projects that we currently have active. All are on grid, roughly about 65% carbon-free. We're seeing a lot more interest and obviously movement on the ESG front to getting behind the meter, particularly at renewables. So I think a lot of interesting opportunities. We'll talk about some of the components with that here in detail. And it's great to be here today.
Thanks, Dave. John Belizaire, nice to see everybody again. CEO of Soluna. We've been in business for about 4 years, mostly converting stranded energy into computing. And over the last couple of years, we've been building a very large pipeline of projects here in the US and beyond with a combination of wind, solar, and hydro. We have some on-grid projects, but we have very large number of off-grid projects that are directly connected to assets that have high degrees of curtailed energy. And we're essentially building mining and beyond computing related to those assets. It's a very exciting time to be in the space, and we think this type of computing can have a very transformational effect on the green energy transition. So I'm excited about this conversation.
Excellent. As you can see, we have really diverse set of panelists with different approaches to Bitcoin mining, and they use different energy sources, so I think we're going to have a good discussion. So my first question is, let's define green energy. What does green mean? And also, how do you think about it? Do you think about it more as binary? You have green energy and non-green energy, or is it more like a scale that some energy generation is greener than the other? And this one, we don't have to go around. Whoever wants to take a question, then later if people want to add to that, we can go like that. So who wants to take it?
I mean, I'll start. From our perspective, green energy is renewable resource, energy that comes from a renewable resource, solar, wind, hydro, where you're essentially not extracting any other element or anything from the planet to generate the resource. And we take a very sort of perhaps dogmatic internally view of it, that you have to really be green and renewable to be green.
And I think that when you're talking about green energy, there can be confusion for sure, because you can still be carbon neutral by buying renewable energy credits. And I do believe, though, on top of what you typically think of as green, solar, hydro, wind, being able to take waste gas, flare gas, and those types of methods too, to be able to really generate a sustainable growth for your future in terms of power generation, because it's going to be very hard, I believe, to do everything on renewables for mining. They're going to have a lot of natural gas, and you've got to be very careful when you're saying green energy to really kind of dive into what do you mean by green energy.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think there's an immense amount of FUD around this topic. It's so political, and it's certainly different shades of green. I don't think there's such thing as fully renewable and what we deal with the fossil fuels today. There's no question that we're in an immense energy transition. The current administration is obviously moving forward with this, and I think to John's point that I think compute and what we do in the Bitcoin mining space can be very unique and applied to it to help that transition along. Some of it's theory, some of it's, again, hasn't necessarily occurred yet, but we're starting to see a paradigm shift in terms of the discussion points and where it goes. But I do think for, some of the discussion topics around RECs and carbon free, you really got to understand the source. You got to understand what some of the other, the topics and what their really ulterior motives are. And obviously, any of these conversations wouldn't be complete with talking about Elon Musk, for example. And I think when you take a step back and really understand the source and the topic and where this really goes, the transition becomes pretty interesting and pretty unique. But directly, definitely different shades of green. We're blind within it. But the renewable component is here. It's certainly not going away. But the transition isn't going to happen overnight. And it's exciting to be a part of that. I'm excited to hear what Aaron has to say with some of the projects as well on the nuclear front, which is, I think, a very important part of the baseload discussion, which I think really gets missed in the dialogue today. I'll set you up.
So a quick thing. So I would consider carbon neutral to be green. I mean, there could be decommissioned weapons that are already out there, the enriched uranium used for power, and obviously storing it, and these are millions of years before the half-life of these elements don't affect Earth anymore, but they are already out there. Finding it and pulling it from Earth, that's a whole different story. But if I consider it carbon neutral, if you're using something that is already going to be stored and is going to be underground anyway, why not use something that was a weapon and now can maybe mine Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the loudest questions we've had so far, right? What is green? And being a recovering politician, having been on kind of the both sides of developing energy and power plants, and then also being on the side of regulating power plants and how a utility generates those resources, you get to kind of see how the sausage is made. And the real construct around green is really, and I don't think anybody out here, this is a secret, but it's really to make people feel good. It's about what do you believe? Just like with Bitcoin or fiat currency or any other structure, what do you believe, right? And if it makes you feel good, then you'll do whatever that construct is. And it's designed to move the masses. So I wouldn't say, I don't think I know what green is. I'm not sure that anybody else knows, but I think they know what makes them feel good. And under that construct, you can decide if nuclear power makes you feel good because it's the only resource required to contain every environmental impact, and that makes you feel good, it's green. If renewables make you feel good, that's green. The construct is certainly man-made, and the impacts, I think, is what we want to try to determine. How does it store value? It's really interesting how energy and cryptocurrencies are a byproduct of each other, right? And they both do the same thing. They store something of future value. And when you decide on one side of the aisle or the other side of the aisle that your construct around the environment makes you feel good, then you could define green. I don't think I can define it. I can just tell you empirical evidence says that having an impact is bad, but being able to mitigate that impact is good. So again, I'm not going to try to define what's green, but I'm going to say the political construct around that is designed to control your mind. So be careful about what you choose and how you use it and how you impose restrictions on other people and their construct about their impact on the environment.
So I'm going to just add a couple things real where the rubber hits the road. And that is the Bitcoin network itself is a capitalist network. And if you're operating a Bitcoin mine, you need to go to the lowest cost power in order to survive. Ebbs and flows. Right now, we're all making a lot of money. This time last year, we're all losing our pants. So you have to go to the lowest cost of power. And if I'm buying power off the grid, the fuel source that company's selling it to me at has to be cheap. And that's really renewables. Solar, hydro, wind. Now, it doesn't, though, have to be all the time. You can turn me off. No one dies at the hospital if I turn off a Bitcoin miner. So there's a couple things that I think are important to realize when you're talking about mining in general, and that is grid stability and the cost of the fuel source. And I think those two things together, when you really start thinking about them, the Bitcoin mining operation itself can be green just from the fact that it's going to add more renewable energy to the network because that's your cheapest energy. And it's also going to help stabilize the grid, the existing grid, which is also green. If I'm stabilizing a grid, that means I'm not turning on peak plants in the middle of the summertime because I have to warm up the Bank of America air conditioning. So, you know, that piece I think is important to talk about whenever you want to talk about green, is that the whole grid stability. And I think most folks at this conference don't, I mean, I'm not an expert in that area, but if you got a couple folks in here that work at DOE and talk about grid stability for the whole country's grid, that's a big deal. And I think that's something to talk about when you're talking about green energy.
And to follow on my first question about the greenness of different energy, there's definitely aspect of, as Aaron, you said, you feel good about using certain energy over the other, but could we quantify some of that greenness, right? And there's also concept of levelized cost of electricity in the energy, right? Where you can compare the cost of various energy sources, where you take some of all the money it takes to produce and generate energy per source over its lifetime, over all the energy that resource produces over its lifetime, and you kind of get dollar per unit of energy production. Do we have anything similar, levelized carbon emission per different energy sources, where we can quantify which energy source is greener than some other one? And because it seems like in the public discourse, people often focus a lot on the emissions, operating emissions, once the resource is built, but maybe they don't take into account certain emissions in building that resource or creating it. So is there a metric to quantify that? If not, how could we, or is it good to maybe come up with it and stick to it?
So you have to look at the total value chain from start to finish. When you're mining lithium, there's environmental impacts. When you're putting natural gas in a generator and emitting carbons, right, there's an impact. There's a lot of really, besides, like you were saying, nuclear, where there's environmental impacts in all types of categories of power generation, and you just have to look, like I said, at the total value chain and see really where those impacts are and be able to quantify them. And yes, there are ways to do it, and I think that it is important to understand.
I guess I'd slightly disagree. I think there shouldn't be, I guess, constraints on what's green, what percentages, if there's a teetering point between this is green, this isn't green. There could be, for example, credits, like Russell was talking about, where he offsets where his green energy isn't. He would buy credits for. So there might be someone on the grid that might be using 10 megawatts and 8 megawatts in the areas coming from a coal plant, but they're buying 8 megawatts of credits from a solar plant on the other side of Earth. So, them using that 8 megawatt credit could mean that solar plant is building out more, and eventually, they either that coal plant sees that it's easier to switch over to natural gas because it's being used, and then maybe 10 years from then, it switches over to solar. I think credits could be another way of thinking about green, even though in the short term, you're not going to shut down a coal power plant if they're making money. Let's prove to them that there's a better way versus, picking and choosing each and every different kind of green and what is and what isn't.
I mean, from my perspective, I was reading Bill Gates' book, climate change book, and I found it fascinating because he really sort of simplified how to think about what is green and what's sort of driving the transition. And what I took away was that you really want to measure things on how much carbon they produce. It's very simple. If it's an energy resource that's producing more carbon in the atmosphere, we want to drive as much as possible to developing technologies or approaches to eliminating that element from our use, if you will. And so when I look at what we're doing here and what everyone on this panel is doing, whether you're doing credits or not, which is sort of a proxy to how do we sort of support new green assets being added on the grid to offset some of the things that are producing carbon, we want to think about, are we helping to bring more green electrons to the global grid infrastructure? Is what we're doing essentially allowing something that would otherwise not be built to be built? And if we're doing that, then that's exceedingly green, and we can sort of measure that. And I agree with you. I think there should be some way to sort of measure assets and how they're coming online with some sort of index of some kind, such that we can favor those new types of resources because they don't produce more carbon. Now, I would agree that, like everyone is saying, it's really hard to do that because if you look at the full supply chain, when we're building data centers, well, we're laying concrete, and making concrete generates a lot of carbon, and so unless our data centers are going to start floating in the air or something, we still have challenges. But if you look at the entire unit as a whole, you can then sort of measure it on how well we've enabled new green resources to get added or to get sustained and increase that percentage on a global basis. And for me, that's the exciting thing about what we're doing here.
I'm just going to add briefly. This, in my opinion, again, this is just my humble opinion, it's a bigger discussion about the entire energy grid in the United States because, like at core, we're connected to the grid. So when I report to you my numbers, I'm reporting to you the grid numbers. Yeah. Now, in Marble, North Carolina, I know for a fact that our power comes from the Hiwassee Dam. You can follow the lines there. But I'm reporting that at like 50% because I'm connected to the grid, and we are connected to the grid. And we do that on purpose. We go and we work with the power companies to say, hey, where do you have stranded power? Where do you have excess capacity? Where do you have existing resources that were written off or depreciated 50 years ago that we can go to? So we're connected to the grid. So I think, and I know this is not the forum for it, but if we're going to have this discussion, it's not just about Bitcoin mining. It's about the entire energy grid system and what percentage of the energy grid. But with that said, I see Bitcoin mining adding a lot of renewable to the energy grid because we are so flexible. We can curtail. They can call Dave and say, hey, Dave, we need you to go off for 30 hours. And we can curtail. And that gives power infrastructure a lot of flexibility. They can put a big old solar plant right beside us, and during the day I pull off that, and at night I pull off the nuke plant because the nuke plant's not being used to fund the manufacturing facility down the road. So I think that's just kind of a bigger discussion to have on the overall energy grid system.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think to Russell's point, it's early innings. And to John's point, I think the real question is additionality. I see a lot of confusion around the way that the voluntary rec markets work. So the renewable energy credits, how do they actually, confirm that there's new renewables being put online as a result of some of that? Also understanding the tax equity and how those components work to actually build out these farms. There's some really interesting perspective and quite honestly some interesting incentives that are created in the way that this happens. And I think the theory is long-term, new renewables can and should come online. And I think that the energy companies are just starting to awaken to this. You talk about two different worlds. Aaron can attest to this very well. The speed that this industry moves versus the speed that the industrial complex of the energy markets, literally looking at 40-year, 50-year types of assets and plans. We're lucky if we can look out 6 months and understand what's going to happen and at the pace and the movement of this. So the convergence of these two markets, understanding that. But long term, I think everybody here at this table, we want a green story. We want to be good citizens to the grid. But absolutely to Russell's point, it starts at the generation and not the usage side. And I know we'll talk about that in some more detail, but that's absolutely got to be the focus.
Yeah, I would agree with that comment. Is that you're talking about intergenerational assets. A lot of the power plants that are powering the load that we serve, some of those existed before we were alive, right? And they will be in existence long after we're gone. You look at a nuclear power plant, it's got an 80-year licensing structure, or hydro, right? Some of those hydro plants in Utah have been around for 100 years, these small little hydros. So if you want to quantify economic and environmental impact as it relates to some kind of structure or measurable metric, you have to go total life cycle of the asset, and not only economic, but environmental. And I would, kind of look at that structure. Again, it's a really kind of interesting comment around what makes you feel good. What makes you feel good at the end of the day? Do you feel like you've done what you were supposed to do, right? And being a steward over both energy and other people's resources that are arguably, it's all shared, right? None of the things we really actually own, we just use. So to give a quantifiable metric that says we were good with that resource, I think you have to go intergenerational and look at what are the impacts long-term, both economic and from a resource perspective. Did we use it as efficiently as the technology would allow us to at the time that we did it?
So I'm actually going to have to disagree with you guys on the on-grid solution. I do believe that all mining will become off-grid. And it's basically impossible to power gigawatts and gigawatts and gigawatts with renewables. Whether we like to admit it or not, most of the hash rate is going to be powered by natural gas, and it will be for the next 5 or so years until battery costs come down or regulatory measures with nuclear become easier to navigate through. But I think that we're kidding ourselves to think that we could bring 5, 6, 7 gigawatts of power online like this when it comes to bringing out batteries, solar, hydro, wind. You just can't meet those types of capacities.
If I can add, there's a bit of a sort of an analogy that I think we should think about when we talk about grid infrastructure, because it's so easy to say that this infrastructure is really old, these industries are really stodgy, and they are. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I've been in some stodgy industries, insurance, they don't move very fast, but they drive a tremendous amount of change in the world. About 20 years ago, I was a young entrepreneur. I was starting my first company, and we were building infrastructure software for enterprises to go to the web, go become e-commerce companies. And at the time, and probably for the next 10 years or so, people were really sort of scratching their heads like, what is this technology really good for? What is the internet really about? TCP/IP, this protocol that sort of drives everything, that's never going to change anything. You're never going to have phones that are completely digital. That makes no sense. Like, that's useless. And the telecommunications industry is really old, and we've got infrastructure that's been around before, the Second World War. That's not going to change, Yet, right now, the entire world runs on internet infrastructure. There has been a complete transformation where all of the infrastructure has been completely replaced and is using that to drive the complete digitization of the world. And so what I've learned from that over the last 20 years is you cannot underestimate the power of technology. Having flexible computing on a global grid infrastructure, in my opinion, is inevitable. In order for you to move to a completely green-powered infrastructure, you're going to need load to be intelligent. And if you think you're going to accomplish that by having everybody put smart devices in their homes, that's just not going to happen. It's not scalable enough. You can't get to that. But if you can make computing part of the grid infrastructure, part of the actual infrastructure of the entire platform, just like today, you have fiber lines underneath the buildings that we're working here that allow us to be completely interconnected, this is going to happen. And the reason is because computing has become such an important part of our society, and every aspects of it, this industry is going to be part of that new society. We're completely changing the way finance is done, and this infrastructure, Bitcoin mining and these data centers, eventually we won't talk about ourselves because it'll be such an integral part of our society that you will no longer talk about TCP/IP or the internet that's sort of flowing. You'll talk about Facebook and all the amazing, crazy applications that have been built on that infrastructure. And I think that's what we're doing here as an industry. And the energy industry is an integral part of that. They just don't know that yet. That's the infrastructure that's going to change over time.
And I mean, we've been 30 minutes in and we haven't really started talking about Bitcoin mining, right? These are all questions about just generally energy production, energy distribution, how energy works. So let's switch now a little bit into Bitcoin mining specifically. And this question is for each of you. What are some of the unique opportunities and unique challenges that you guys are facing in operating a Bitcoin mining operation, given your specific approach or specific energy that you're using? And we have everything from natural gas, wind, solar, all the way to nuclear here on the panel, as well as on-grid and off-grid. So what are some of the challenges and unique opportunities? And this time we're going to start from the other end. Aaron.
Well, one of the projects that we're currently in due diligence on is, surprise, nuclear power, right? And I don't think you can get away with the question or get away from that question without talking about what I think was the elephant in the room about, hey, natural gas, if you're going to spin something up right away, immediately flare gas, or it's just, it's part of that. We've been involved in that business and built pipelines for that infrastructure before. But you cannot get away from the discussion about Bitcoin mining without addressing voltage support. I know that sounds very kind of technical and kind of down in the weeds, but these guys know voltage support is absolutely critical, and it's why you can't get away from old infrastructure. Renewables by themselves don't generate the voltage needed to push the electrons through the network because they don't have a spinning reserve, right? They're more like storage, so you have to have something either like a combined cycle unit, you got to have nuclear, you got to have coal, you have to have something that is a spinning reserve that pushes the electrons on to keep the network support, or it blows out at the transformers, right? So in growth in the Bitcoin mining network, and every mining network, you have to ask yourself, does the location where you're going to spin up your new project, what is their spinning reserves like? What is their voltage support like? And tell you in the Western US, what's happening is that they're shutting down so much coal and putting on so much renewables that they're having, this famous graph that came about probably 11 or 12 years ago called the duck curve. You guys are familiar with the duck curve structure and the curtailment that takes place. And now you basically are building two resources when you used to build one resource. So you're building natural gas, combined cycle, or simple cycle units for shaping, and then you're building the other intermittent generation to fill baseload. It's almost backwards of what it is. The Western U.S. is in a crazy mess at this point because of that structure. In fact, we had a conversation with a coal-fired power plant. They're now charging 7 to 8 cents a kilowatt hour. When everybody thought that this push to renewables was going to kill off coal-fired power plants, what it's actually done is made them more profitable. So you cannot forget voltage support, which is the backbone of what we're doing with Bitcoin mining.
Well, to your point, Aaron, look no further than what happened in Japan, right? Following Fukushima, when all the base load was taken off, renewables went in. You can look at the grid pricing over there, but north of 27 cents. So I mean, it's crazy. Your question directly. So I come from the background data centers for 25 years, and getting into this space in 2017. I candidly had to unlearn a lot of things that I knew about compute and about data centers. And there's really four unique key components that I think is the first of many use cases of what we call at Compute North, tier 0 computing. So to John's point of being much more smart, much more ubiquitous along the way it works with the energy markets. And it's crazy load factor, right? 95%, which they love. Large scale loads, hundreds of megawatts at a time. It's interruptible, which is a key part that Russell talked about. And I think one of the things that gets overlooked a lot is it can be put nearly anywhere. Traditional data centers got to be close to the eyeballs. There's latency issues. You need to be close to the workforce. There's all types of concerns about just in terms of the geography around that. Our application has none of those things. And the value to the power constructs, the grid operators, the independent power producers, anyone in that sector is absolutely immense when they start to peel it back. The challenge is to get them to understand, what is this space? What is this about? Is this something that's going to be here in 5, 10, 20 years from now? John, I see it the same way. I mean, I see it as layer 8, right? So it is a standard amongst the internet. It's critical infrastructure. It's going to be here for a long time, and it's the second inning. I mean, there's so much innovation. It's still so wonky and so hard to use. In 5 years, this conference is going to be 10 times the size. There's going to be a lot more people dressed nicely like John. So it's a fun ride.
I think that the challenge that we have is, our particular model, we're going after stranded energy, and so you're going to a power plant owner, and I'm not dressed like this, but I show up in my truck and it's got the nice Soluna logo and say, hey, I noticed those wind turbines aren't turning so much. What's the problem? And it says, a damn grid won't let me put my power up there. And what I've got to offer that power plant owner is a well-structured PPA that allows me to build an infrastructure solution to that problem that will be with them for the life of the plant. And that requires a tremendous amount of capital. It requires understanding of energy markets and a host of different technical aspects, as have been mentioned here. And I think the key challenge to that model to scale over time is the cost of capital, because you're basically an infrastructure company. And over time, as you start to build larger and larger and a larger network of these things, you have to reduce that cost of capital. Now, our particular application in the near term, being that it's Bitcoin mining focused, and you're talking to a power plant owner that is backed by some of the largest pension funds in the world, who are also using low-cost capital, their perception is that this is very risky, there's a lot of volatility. How do I smooth the revenues so that I can either invest in this or take on this partnership? And so we think the key to really unlocking this approach to getting our capabilities becoming part of the infrastructure is to greatly reduce our cost of capital. And if we can find a way to essentially securitize or introduce some sort of hash rate forward concept into this marketplace, it could significantly change the amount of projects and the scale that we can do. And we've been working a lot with partners exploring this whole concept of how do you bring to this industry very well structured projects that look like they should to this marketplace, because it's the energy space, that will attract capital that traditionally doesn't come into this space but is very interested in infrastructure development. When you have $700 billion going into the clean energy infrastructure and clean energy revolution, look, you can't cut checks to, that many startups trying to build a scalable battery. At some point, you're going to have to put that extra $50 billion that's coming in this year into real companies that can build something that has value over time. And we expect that capital to come into these types of projects. And so coming up with models that can significantly, work away the volatility perception that is with the business that we're in, and create more structure around these projects so that we can get in low-cost capital. That's something that we're working on.
So it's hard to follow all these guys, at least say anything intelligent. But you ask about Bitcoin mining and where the rubber hits the road, where there's going to be issues going forward. And for right now, last year, led by Riot and Marathon and some others, American capitalism kind of woke up to Bitcoin mining as a thing, right? And we started ordering a lot of machines here in the United States and Canada and North America. So those of us in the infrastructure business were already building as fast as we could. We were literally building as fast as we could because there's hundreds of thousands of machines already headed this way that the big American capitalism money got behind and said, hey, we want some mining. And then all of a sudden, the Chinese Communist Party, for their 100th anniversary, decided, this year's 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, we're going to change the network in China. And so they decided to do something and get some attention. And that created another huge wave. So, a tsunami, really. And he was just talking about this as far as it's going to be very difficult for the infrastructure. And I don't mean our infrastructure. I mean transformers and switch gear. Do you know how big a 50 megawatt transformer is for a substation? Do you know what it takes to move it down the road? There's only a few companies in the world that make those kind of things. And that kind of critical infrastructure that we're going to try to be building out over the next 12 to 18 months is going to be a monster issue to solve. And here in North America, we're going to try to solve it as much as we can. Our friends in China, some are going to go to Kazakhstan, some are going to go into Russia. If they have aspirations to be public one day, they're going to try to come here. They might go, some's going to spread out in Northern Europe. But what's going to happen is the existing infrastructure is going to get filled up very, very fast. And then everybody's going to be looking around and going, okay, who can build stuff the fastest? Where are the transformers coming from? Where are the substations coming from? Where's the voltage coming from? Where's the load going to come from? It's going to push all that stuff. And all that's questions that Bitcoin mining operators and infrastructure operators, we're going to have to deal with for a while.
So I wanted to switch it up a little bit, and I think one of the challenges not only is electrically, but electronic waste. I think electronic waste, especially in the Bitcoin world, the S1s, they have been profitable in years. The S3s, unless you're like at less than a cent a kilowatt hour, those are profitable. S5, same thing. S7s, S9s is where I think under 2 cents a kilowatt hour is profitable right now. But in 5 years, S1 through S19 most likely will not be profitable. This is hundreds of thousands of, equipment. That's just from Antminer, Silicon, What's Miner, all these people here that have made all of this hardware that is literally just going to be thrown away. Unless you desolder the chips, and maybe you can use the PSUs, but a lot of them aren't compatible with the new hardware because the wattage differences. But I think hardware waste is going to be a big problem in the future. Me saying this as a GPU miner where I sell all my excess GPUs to gamers that are going to play Call of Duty on them later, this is an issue that, I guess I wanted to bring up for the Bitcoin miners because it was an issue that we did come up with, but, not to say that it isn't a problem that we'll have to deal with too.
So clearly there's a lot of obstacles and challenges that we're going to see the next few years and beyond. I believe the two biggest challenges you're going to see is transformation. So stepping down from high voltage lines all the way to 415, 240, which each of these computer servers require, or in that range. And then the grid resiliency and grid cost. You're talking about everyone needing power, everyone getting on the grid. And if all these Bitcoin miners come on the grid, it's going to be the same thing that you saw in Washington State. It's the same thing that you see every place, every time Bitcoin miners congregate in an area, the rates go up, and everything, the locals rates go up, and there's a lot of issues that you're going to see coming from this on-grid, and that's one of the big reasons why I believe off-grid is the final frontier solution. Because, for instance, right now, our sites, the generators output 415, 240, so there is no transformation. And we also have fixed costs and don't need hedging, and it's truly resilient to having to source transformers and having to not be scared that you just acquired this substation, you're going to hedge and make X kilowatt hour. But what happens when hundreds and hundreds or gigawatts of power come online in Texas, and then everyone's paying 6-7 cents? It's not sustainable in the long term.
Good. So let's switch gears a little bit. There's been recently a lot of ESG investing narratives entering our space, and specifically around green Bitcoin being flagged and different than other Bitcoin, meaning let's try to track how Bitcoin came into existence, how it was produced. So question around the narrative, do you guys think that that's ultimately, if adopted even more, could that hurt Bitcoin's fungibility? If we start saying that this Bitcoin is green and this one is not, and this one is maybe worth more, there's also rumors that green Bitcoin could have a premium in the market. Could that hurt Bitcoin in the long term?
So I've heard the narrative. I've never seen anyone pay additional for virgin Bitcoin or green Bitcoin. I think, fundamental to Bitcoin, to the network, to the protocol is its fungibility. And that's not going anywhere. I mean, I've even been, at a conference 6 weeks ago, one of my friends on stage mentioned that and was literally booed at the conference because of that discussion. So I keep hearing the narrative. I've yet to see it. I don't see that changing, my personal opinion.
Yeah, +1 on that. That's pretty core. I think this question is done. I mean, I don't know what else we would say. But I do think we should track the computing. Going back to the sort of the core of this conference, like, is the computing that generated it green, so that we can focus on whether this computing is really helping to drive more renewable energy onto the grid. But the asset that it creates should have all the characteristics that make it a form of digital asset and money, and fungibility is important. A Bitcoin is a Bitcoin. A dollar is a dollar. That's sort of a non-starter from my perspective.
I would do a +1 and add, if you really want a green one, I guess you can get one of the first 10 million that were mined on like 4 GPUs, right? Like, how much power was used for those first 5 or 6, 8 years?
I think you may have people like Greta Thunberg that would pay a little bit more. Who knows? I'm agreeing. I think that y'all are spot on for the most part.
So I think a new coin wouldn't make sense, but you could actually have miners and pools or people that send their transaction out point to pools that prove that they only accept hash from renewable energies. So it wouldn't be worth, the Bitcoin was still a Bitcoin, but the pools that have renewable energies would get more transactions, which would mean more profits for the miners in that. So I do see a possibility of having transactions make renewable energy miners more money.
I guess underpinning the logic behind that is that if we're going to be more conscious with the societal impacts of use of energy, you've got to become either more efficient or have multiple uses for the same resource. right? So what we see and what kind of in some of the programming that we've been doing lately is that hash rate has to have multiple purposes. So right now, hash rate secures a single network, or if you have, say, like a delayed proof of work protocol, you can secure multiple networks. And what we see with Bitcoin is that we look at the hash rate on Bitcoin more like a utility, and that is actually becomes more like electricity itself. It's a commodity, and it shapes, it can peak. We've seen that on the networks. But the utility for it, just to run a single payment system, has to do multiple things. And so when you have an application layer in other networks where you can secure other networks with the hash rate of another network, now you've become twice as efficient and twice as economic, and you've used half the resources to secure another network. And what's more, quote unquote, green than being more efficient with the same electricity?
And on that one, I would add my thoughts. I think for other networks to be merge mined with Bitcoin, maybe it makes sense for them. I think it is good for Bitcoin that the Bitcoin's hash rate and the ASICs are only mining on SHA-256 because it helps minimize the attack vectors. There couldn't be any other use cases that at some point for various reasons could decide to maybe reorg or 51% attack the Bitcoin network. But I do agree with you, if there's multiple uses, it is greener or more efficient from that side. Okay, it seems like we all agree on green Bitcoin and no premium, so I'm going to try to find topics where we disagree. Let's go back to kind of renewable energy, and is there a future where we could be 100% renewable? Is there even, and not even, I'm not even talking just about Bitcoin, just generally society, can it run on renewable? Are there issues with intermittency, availability, reliability with renewable energy? And obviously we do not have the storage capacity technology available yet. So do you guys think that we will have 100% renewable future? If yes, when? And if not, why not?
I can start. So I think certainly that's the aspiration. I think you need to look no further than the events of what happened in February in Texas to understand just the magnitude of the problem that we're trying to solve and the challenges that it faces. Everybody loves to say green energy is great, green energy is good, and certainly we're no exception to that. But when you turn on the lights at your house, you want to make sure they work. You want your refrigerator to work. You want to have air conditioning, health, human services, hospitals, essential services like that. And the fact of the matter is the bulk of the renewables that we're putting in right now on the grid are intermittent. So wind, sometimes it's not windy, sometimes the sun doesn't shine, and there is always going to be a need for base load. I think it's really interesting, and Aaron, I'm looking forward to your answer on this, for the need for why nuclear is not considered part of the green narrative, because it makes so much sense from my standpoint. Certainly there's issues. It's got some scary components to it, and I think that's a lack of understanding. But when you really pull it apart, it by far away makes the most economic sense, the most engineering sense, and I think has the most scale to bring us to really what we're trying to do is, stop climate change, stop the carbon components, and I think that narrative needs to come to the forefront. And I think what's happening right now is going to force that, because people want renewable, but they also want to make sure that they have their homes are powered.
So right now, and for the foreseeable next 5 years to 10 years, you're going to see, in my opinion, most Bitcoin mines are going to be powered off natural gas. If you think about in 5 years from now, when storage for batteries costs come down, then I believe there'll be a huge push. But for instance, if you want to be completely solar-based with batteries and completely renewable, for 100 megawatts, it's going to cost you $1 billion in capital cost, right? And over a 20 or so year period, that's 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour, not including install and all the other costs that you have involved. Where for $1 billion, we could build out in 6 months to a year. For $1 billion, you could get a gigawatt, and faster too. So you're getting 10 times the amount of power, and you're also getting it in 6 to 12 months, and not 12 to 18, 24 months. And I believe that the name of the game is we need to get the miners up. The miners need to be hashing, and we can't sit around and wait for new technology to come out because we bought these yesterday, or they arrived yesterday, and we got to plug them in tomorrow. Where are we going to do that? And it's very hard to be able to just be fully renewable in the foreseeable future. I do believe one more thing. I do believe nuclear is the final frontier. So that's the end game.
Yeah, no, I think Devin hit the nail on the head. If it's solar and battery storage, if it's a dam obviously is 24/7. I do like nuclear. I think that the storage problem for nuclear waste can be solved in the future. Obviously, it's an issue now. I mean, they're putting nuclear waste in barrels that are going under, dozens of feet of concrete, and they're just, hey, what's going to happen to it? Who knows? It's going to just decay for the next couple million years, and hope there's no exposure. But in the future, who knows? Chemistry might come up with something that could use every bit of energy that could come out of that, even when it is already through the waste. Or there could be renewables that can send water to a storage, and then at night when there is no sun, the storage is opened up, and a pump at the bottom of where the water is stored runs where obviously the sun's not shining. So I think it is possible, and we're probably a couple decades away, but I think natural gas is going to take coal away, and renewables is going to take natural gas away eventually.
Yeah, it's interesting that the nuclear aspect keeps coming up, and maybe I can answer a question for you on the waste issue, because there is a solution already. But going to 100% renewables, again, I'm not sure I know what that means, really, right? I mean, when you look at from a atomic level of all particles and everything that goes on, what really is renewable, right? When we talk about a resource that comes around or that is generated without itself, that violates the laws of thermodynamics, right? There's no such thing, really. But when you talk about energy density, then you have atomic level energy, which is the most dense resource that we have. For example, when you run a nuclear power plant, it runs basically flat out base load for 18 months to 2 years. And then we refuel it. That fuel that they're taking out actually has 95% of the energy still in it. And the only reason that is not recycled is it's more economic to make new fuel than it is to recycle the old fuel. So currently, all the nuclear fuel, used fuel, in the United States, if you pile it up, it would basically fit about in this conference room, about 30 feet deep. And that's since the first commercial nuclear reactor in the United States started operations, right? And so it's very, very dense. And when you re-enrich it, so they take it out, reprocess it, re-enrich it, the byproducts from that re-enriching process can be vitrified in glass and stored underground, and within 400 years, it's inert. So the spent fuel issue is totally taken care of already. It's a matter of economics about whether or not we want to pay to either mine new uranium out of the ground or to re-enrich the fuel, right? So that's not an issue. It's a matter of economics. So the real question about 100% renewables, at least for me, in what construct, again, what do you want to believe? right? It's a political question. In politics, one of the first things you learn to do is frame the debate so that whoever is on the other side of your argument is put on the defense. And that's really what renewable is, that construct of what does renewable means in your mind, or what is it in the public domain. That debate has been had, and framing that in people's minds in your question is a little bit loaded. I'm not sure anybody in this room knows how to answer that question. I certainly don't. But it's a construct to determine where do we want to put resources. And if 100% renewables as wind and solar is where you want to put it, and the cost, have at it. You know, utilities love to they love to build resources because they make money like banks. They don't make money based off of what they sell. They make it off of inflating their assets, right? Totally different. Most people don't have that understanding about what a utility really does. Their goal is to have the largest fleet of generation, the most expensive generation possible, because then you have to pay for it. There's no alternative. That's what a utility does, right?
I'm going to add, and it's really hard to follow that guy. And again, I know what I don't know. And what I don't know, or what I do know, is that this is not a problem that Bitcoin mining needs to solve. But this is a problem that Bitcoin miners can be a really good customer for the folks that do need to solve this problem. Because Bitcoin miners, we have some very unique characteristics that I think will help solve a problem going forward in the future. But I think this is an industry, this is a global power grid industry kind of issue. And I think as we look out into the future, we're going to just be one piece of the overall puzzle and one piece of the overall solution, because we can go anywhere. We can go on stranded locations. We can be curtailed. We have a 95% base load. We have a lot of characteristics that can help be one of the cogs in the solution, but we can't solve the problem ourselves as an industry.
Yeah, Yuri, I will say my piece. When I get those kind of questions, I just focus more on an envisioned future state, you know. And the way I would answer your question is I would say, on my 80th birthday, I'm approaching 50, but I'll wake up and I'll turn the light on, and the electrons that power the illumination of my home will come from a globally interconnected grid that is powered majoritarily by renewable, sustainable energy, breakthroughs in transmission, energy storage, flexible and smart load, and new breakthroughs in energy sources. Maybe it's a better version of nuclear, maybe it's something else, but at the end of the day, I think as a species, we're going to get to a point where we solve this problem. I'm an eternal optimist. There's nothing that can prevent us from solving pretty much anything. You know, if a guy worth $206 billion can send a phallic-shaped rocket for 10 minutes into the sky, I think we can solve getting sustainable grids going with Bitcoin being part of the infrastructure.
I believe that Bitcoin miners, because I mean, you're seeing a redistribution of wealth in this industry, and once we've solved all these Chinese miners coming into the U.S. and all around the world, and we're thinking about future growth strategies, a lot of these groups are going to be sitting on a lot of cash or Bitcoin. And I believe that the smart miners are going to be the ones that are going to invest R&D into new renewable or nuclear technologies. I believe that the mining community is going to be a part of that push, and you're seeing it already with ASICs. For instance, 7-nanometer chips. We pushed it to the limit. We need better. Everything, we're like a bull in a china shop. Everywhere we go, we disrupt. And I believe that we will disrupt the energy sector for the good.
Awesome. And we are almost at time. I think this was a great discussion. We had lots of agreements and some disagreements. I think we barely just scratched the surface. There's so much more to discuss. And what I'm excited about is, and I've been in this space for a long time, in those early Bitcoin conferences, you would just have a panel on Bitcoin mining and then panel on layer 2 and scaling. And now we have dedicated conferences like Mining Disrupt to Bitcoin mining, or dedicated conferences to Lightning Network. And I think over the next couple of years, we will have conferences on just nuclear energy and mining and natural gas and mining. And those are really conferences where we will be able to dig deep into these topics and expand them further. So thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists, and bye.
Nice job.